So let's talk about some safety planning. We've talked a lot about all of the scams and things, but what can we do when we're facing these things or before these things happen? So the first thing is going back to the basics. So we all, as service providers, have a role to play in responding to technology-facilitated abuse and supporting these older adults that have been impacted. Many of us may be helping these victims directly with some level of safety planning and even in our personal lives too. So even for the most seasoned providers, which I'm sure many of you are, it can be really helpful to revisit the basics from time to time. When working with any victim of any crime, not just financial crimes, and whether this is professionally or personally, start by believing them and be mindful of the language you use and not placing the blame on the victim. We know that technology abuse, scams, or fraud can and do happen to anyone. Like Kim said, the younger adults are being targeted even more than older adults. So we know this can happen to anyone, not just older adults. Avoid why questions. Why did you do this? Why did you trust them? That really tends to make victims defensive. And use language that places the responsibility for the crime on the perpetrator and not the victim, because ultimately, the perpetrator is the one who did this. It's not the victim's fault. It's important to engage the victim as an active participant in safety planning and making sure that we follow their lead and respect their decisions. We know that victims are the experts on their needs and safety, so we need to make sure that any safety plan we're doing is with them, not for them, and fits into their life. But of course, there can always be barriers when working with older adults. There are varying levels of mental capacity, physical mobility, and support systems. So some of those things will present challenges in safety planning. There are some helpful safety planning resources in the handouts that you can access from this presentation.
I just wanted to jump in really quickly too to add what you were saying around language, Ashton, because I think it's really important, especially in the financial fraud space. I think we see a lot of victim blaming language, and we don't always think about it as victim blaming language. And so if you've ever seen a news article about a scam or fraud, or just how people generally talk about it, oftentimes we're using language like, this person was fooled, or they fell victim to a scam, right? Which places a lot of blame on the person that was impacted. And so I think it's really important to be really thoughtful about how we talk about financial fraud, both with a victim, but generally as we're doing education or building awareness around this, and thinking about that, because there is quite a bit of shame and embarrassment that comes along with this victimization. Um, and it can create barriers to reporting, or identifying as a victim of financial fraud. And yeah, just something to keep in mind that that language really has power. And as Ashton said, this impacts people of all ages and all backgrounds. We actually see some scams are really actually targeted more towards very well-educated people. I'm seeing stories of people even in the financial sector that have experienced victimization of financial fraud. So even those of us that know what to look for, those tactics are really, really effective. And oftentimes these schemes are very sophisticated. They're carried out by more than one person. So it's oftentimes like a group of people. And again, they're just very sophisticated, and sometimes they develop over a long period of time. And so even those of us that know all of this information could potentially experience financial fraud. So I think that's just important to note, and I'll give it back to you, Ashton.
Yeah, that is really important. Thank you, Kim. So, setting realistic expectations is very important. It's one way that as service providers, we can best support survivors, is being transparent about the recovery process. Unfortunately, recovery often requires a lot of time and effort from the victim, um, as you know, gathering bank documents, text messages, all of those kinds of things. Unfortunately, financial recovery is rare because fraudsters will dispose of assets immediately. I used to tell the victims that I worked with, they're not taking your money and investing it, they're taking your money and spending it. Um, for a case that is successfully prosecuted, which is amazing, restitution is an option, but from my experience, there are a lot of barriers for victims to get full payment, and it often doesn't happen. These can be really difficult conversations to have with the victims, but having them also helps them trust you and trust the system and helps them develop realistic goals. If they're not going into it thinking, I'm going to recover all 1.2 million that this person took from me. Um, if you don't give them that false expectation, they will trust you more. Being honest and transparent, excuse me, about this is one of the most valuable responses that victims can receive from service providers. Context is important, and we talk about context in a lot of different crime types. And it's very important here, and feelings are important. Feelings are often very much involved in a lot of these scams, like the grandparent scams and the romance scams. Consider asking the victim that you're working with how this has negatively impacted them. They may have answers that surprise you. It may, and typically is not, just about the money. What has changed in their daily life, or how has their quality of life changed? If, the perpetrator is targeting some of those assistive technologies and things like that, the quality of their daily life may have drastically changed or decreased. And do your best with all of this information to identify ongoing safety concerns, especially if the perpetrator is someone that the victim knows. And technology facilitated abuse can be very difficult to prove. Like Kim said, these scammers are experts and very sophisticated oftentimes. So it can be very difficult to track what's going on and prove it. Identifying evidence and preserving it where you can is very helpful. Getting all the records and information that you're able to is very helpful. I always found as an advocate working with these victims, it's helpful to start a file with all the relevant case information. So any phone logs, text messages, bank statements, checks they sent, anything like that. And this file can continue to grow as, law enforcement may become involved, and eventually maybe prosecution becomes involved. And ultimately, it will be hopefully easier if the victim starts compiling this file.
And I just wanted to note, we have such limited time with you all today. And so this, we aren't able to go through every single kind of component of creating a plan, supporting a victim. And so we've kind of done the work for you outside of this. We have a partnership with the FINRA Education Foundation. And through that partnership, we developed a taking action guide for professionals that work with victims of financial fraud. And it is amazing. We have a PDF version available online, and you can also order physical copies of the guide, but it goes into the different types of fraud, and then it has step-by-step instructions on what a victim can do, such as building a case file, who to report to based on the specific type of fraud or scam that they experienced, how to, put a credit freeze, credit alerts, how to go through that process, and who to contact. So that's a resource that I highly recommend. It is included in our resource handouts, along with the presentation materials. we knew that we wanted to have enough time to get through the information that we have here today. So that is in our separate resource document, but I wanted to call your attention to it and encourage you to check that out and look to that for kind of more concrete step-by-step instructions on what victims can do after they've experienced financial fraud. We also wanted to spend some time just kind of going through some tips and tricks for you to be aware of, things that you can be educating your communities about. If any of you are doing any kind of prevention work or risk reduction work, these are important things to include. Even if you're not specifically talking about financial fraud, helping people understand this information can be really helpful to them. So this is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but we wanted to cover a few helpful tips. So first, when it comes to devices, we always encourage people to have a firewall and antivirus software installed on their computer and devices. This can add another layer of protection and security from unwanted access. If someone accidentally clicks a link that is potentially a phishing link, these tools can help to alert you that that was potentially an unsecure link, or that someone's trying to gain access to your device. Depending on the device, I know like Apple products, iPhones, for example, have different safety check features, which you can kind of Google and find information about how to access those tools. iPhones, you can quickly stop sharing information if your device is potentially compromised, and you can review and update who information is shared with, what apps get access to information, things like that. And then if someone's device has been compromised or they're concerned that it has been, we encourage people to discontinue using that device or minimizing what you do and being aware because you don't want people to have that unwanted access. When it comes to accounts, there's a lot of different things that we can do proactively. One of those things is two-step or multi-step authentication. It's also known as two-factor authentication. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. A lot of our accounts require it now. But this is essentially where, in addition to having a password, you have another layer of security in order to access your account. So you might get a code via text or email or even a phone call. There's apps out there that also do that. Security questions is another way, another layer of security for our accounts. And that one in particular, I think, is important to be really intentional and thoughtful about because security questions can sometimes be information that other people in our lives know about us. And if we think about romance scams, for example, those are questions that people can easily kind of ask under the guise of they're getting to know someone. But perpetrators out there may know, okay, these are pretty common security questions. I'm gonna, in talking with this person, ask them these questions, get their information, and potentially be able to guess their security question answers. And so when possible, use more complex or less known security questions. And in cases of like abuse where they know like an abuser may have access to that information, I always encourage people put an answer that's different, put a random maiden name or, put a different city than you were born in so that someone can't kind of guess that information. We also encourage people to be really careful about what they're doing on public or free Wi-Fi. So this is like when you're at your local Starbucks or in the airport or things like that. Don't make financial transactions when you're on free Wi-Fi. Don't access your accounts because you don't know who else could have access to that network and could be monitoring other people on the network and gathering that information. So always, being on a password protected secure network when you're doing those things. Changing passwords if you are concerned, or you know that someone has gained access to your account. In some cases, you may have to create a new account. You see this sometimes like on social media. If someone hacks into their account, they immediately change their password, and then the actual, account owner can't get back in, and it sometimes can be really difficult to like prove that they are who they are and that their account was hacked. So sometimes you have to create a whole new account. Some of these probably seem really like straightforward and common sense, but things like strong passwords, I think we all probably have, done like having the same password for multiple accounts or having easy passwords, because it is really hard to remember hundreds of passwords that we might need in our daily lives. And so just remembering to have really strong passwords for all your accounts, the longer the better, having combination of characters, not using words or phrases that people can guess. Don't let your password be 1234 or password 1234. And logging out of accounts when you're done, especially if you're on like a public device, like at your public library. If you're logging into your accounts or things there, like make sure you don't check the keep me signed in or remember me, or remember my password. Those are sometimes just automatically checked, or we're just in the habit of doing that. And that would open up other people to access your accounts. So making sure you don't select those and you log out when you're done. And then lastly, some tips and tricks around scams and fraud specifically, being really cautious in wiring money. So don't wire money to people you don't really know in real life. And a lot of banks and financial institutions are good about asking questions. I know last time I had to wire money, they're like, who is this going to? Like, how do you know them? And they do that right to make sure that people are not potentially being targeted by a scammer. Being cautious with money orders. Gift cards is a big way that scammers get money. And again, it feels like common sense. A lot of us are like, of course, I would never pay the IRS with a gift card. But I can tell you that people that experience this fraud also knew that. And those like time sensitive threats of, there's going to be a warrant out for your arrest. It gets people into those heightened emotional states, and we're not necessarily thinking with our logical brain in those moments. And so it can be really difficult. And yeah, considering how you pay for things online, making sure that you understand your institution's policies around disputing charges, if there's fraud protections in place, is important to know. And then reporting options. Again, I would direct folks to check out our Taking Action Guide, because this provides a better breakdown of the reporting options and who exactly to report what to. Of course, people can report to law enforcement, and we've kind of covered some of the potential barriers or challenges that folks might have in doing that. Depending on the platform where maybe a fraud took place, if it was a dating app or a social media site, you can also, there's typically, ways for you to report that kind of activity to the platform itself. And then depending on the situation, there may be options to report to like the Federal Trade Commission, Social Security Administration. The Better Business Bureau has a scam tracker that anyone can go and report scams that they've been presented with, whether or not they engaged with them. So it's a great consumer tool out there to go on and see. I know I've looked at it at times where I'm like, I got this weird text message, and I kind of go on to see, are other people getting this? So that's a really helpful tool for people to be aware of as well.